Howdy everyone, and today I'm testing out the new, least expensive camera in Canon's new RF mount lineup, one which could quite possibly take over the world a little bit, the EOS R50. Here it is in white with a silver 18 to 45mm kit lens. It's also available in black, and it costs $680 without a lens over in America, or a much more expensive £780 here in the UK. I'd like to thank Canon for loaning me one for a week for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. Canon have a nice little history of occasionally really pulling things out of the bag with their low budget camera offerings. I'll never forget my first digital SLR, the old Canon 550D. It was the first really affordable digital SLR with 1080p video, and its impressive at the time 18 megapixel sensor made it a complete winner. Their more recent EOS M50 cameras on their little EOS M mirrorless camera system were also super popular, being the #1 best-selling mirrorless cameras on the US market at one point. But the future for Canon lies in its new RF mount system, whose much bigger mount allows for full-frame camera lenses to be made and used too, even though this new camera only has a smaller APS-C sized sensor, which will crop your image in by 1.6 times. Just look at the size of that lens mount in comparison to the small sensor inside. It's a wonder Canon were able to design the camera body around it to be so small. So it seems apparent that, to draw in some new customers, Canon have taken the older EOS M50 camera body here, smoothed out its hard edges, put in an RF mount, while also giving it a number of improved features. For example, it can now shoot as fast as 12 frames per second, and even 15 frames per second with the electronic shutter, up from the M50 Mark II's 7.4 frames per second. It doesn't have a huge buffer though, and will start to slow down pretty quickly after a while. The R50 also has a high-resolution screen, much sharper than the old M50 Mark II, as well as slightly better battery life and a very slightly lighter weight, as well as having a body with a lovely rubber texture instead of just plastic. Still, shooters will be happy to see it can shoot exposures up to 1/4000th of a second, either as normal JPEGs or as 10-bit HDR PQ HEIF images, as well as shooting in RAW, compressed or normal. It also has anti-flicker shooting and silent electronic shooting too. I also got good results from its in-camera HDR shooting mode, as you can see here. What's more, the new R50 is a much better camera for video work than the older EOS M50 cameras, shooting in 4K without any cropping and with full autofocus controls, unlike the older M50 Mark II, and has various powerful electronic stabilization modes, as well as with focus breathing correction. It can even shoot 10-bit HDR 422 quality video internally for more serious video work, and it will shoot up to an hour of footage at a time. Put that all together and it makes this camera seriously capable for a lower budget option, and on specifications alone it's a great choice right from the start. This thing really is quite powerful. Its specs are pretty future-proof for the price you're paying. When it comes to build quality, I like the tiny size of this camera, but its grip isn't so small that you cannot hold it comfortably. I particularly like its rubberized feel around the rear and front panels. Much less comfortable though is trying to press its buttons with your thumb. Those buttons have a lovely, positive, clicky feel to them, but your thumb will really begin to ache when stretching it back to use them. Well, that's kind of part and parcel of the handling of a small camera anyway. Thankfully, the touchscreen is very responsive and intuitive to use, which beginner photographers who are perhaps more used to shooting with their phones will really appreciate. There's also a very handy advanced auto mode, which makes everything super easy for beginners and similar to a smartphone interface, if that's the experience you want, of course. You can of course always shoot in more advanced modes like aperture priority, shutter priority or fully manual. The camera uses Canon's pretty small LPE17 batteries, which are good enough for about 350 shots or so, or a bit over an hour of 4K video shooting, so you might want to keep a spare handy if you're doing a lot of work. The camera has one SD card slot, which only supports the slower speed UHS 1 standard. The top of the camera is very simply laid out. Well, there's not really enough space on its small size for fancy dials or displays. I like the nice positive on-off switch, but the mode selector dial turns a little too easily. It's easy to accidentally change modes here. On the sides of the camera we get a microphone input, very useful for video work, but no headphone socket. On the other side we get micro HDMI and USB-C ports, and on the top a little pop-up flash, not very powerful. Oh, and something else I love about this camera is its autofocus system, because despite costing less than $700, the EOS R50 is virtually as good as my own $3,500 Canon EOS R5 camera, with fast, silent, easy to use autofocus with a variety of different tracking subjects. I found it to be quite intelligent at picking up and tracking whatever I wanted it to focus on. This really is brilliant to see on such an affordable camera. If it doesn't pick the subject focus on that you want, simply touch it on the screen and it'll track it for you. Sweet. So that's its build quality, functional, but actually really quite nice, and certainly simple enough. Let's look at its still image quality now. This camera has a 24 megapixel APS-C sized sensor, as I mentioned. As you can see here, its raw images capture plenty of fine detail with all the usual nice Canon colours you come to expect. But the JPEG images aren't far behind in terms of resolution, which was a weak point of older Canon cameras. They are still looking fairly crisp. Let's look at noise levels now. ISO 100/400 is clean. At ISO 800 you can see noise creeping into finer details, and ISO 1600 is beginning to look a little messy. At ISO 3200 and 6400 we see quite a loss in detail, and at anything more than 6400 picture quality begins to fall apart quite badly. So really, it's just an average performance for noise here for an APS-C camera, but not bad, and at lower ISOs we see great detail in your images. The camera's dynamic range is just okay here, just average for an APS-C camera. This is one area where more expensive full-frame cameras can mostly do better. Let's take a look at video quality now. This is 4K video at 25 frames per second. At ISO 100, the video quality is excellent, really detailed, with no noise or difficult artifacts. This is great stuff for a lower budget camera. The quality remains very good up to ISO 800, where a little detail is getting lost, and at ISO 1600 things are getting pretty grainy. ISO 3200 is fairly rough, and 6400 and beyond is, well, I wouldn't use those settings unless in an emergency. It's important to bear that in mind though, if you're planning on shooting video indoors with one of Canon's little kit lenses with their relatively dark apertures. For very good results, you may want to invest in brighter aperture lenses here. So the camera's video quality is very detailed, but about as noisy as average for an APS-C camera. When it comes to rolling shutter, unfortunately we have a scorching case here with a major horizontal jelly effect during panning movements when shooting in 4K. When shooting in 1080p, it's still there but reduced, so a bit of a weak point really. The camera also offers a high frame rate 1080p slow motion mode at up to 120 frames per second, which also gives nice quality high definition video. Always a cool feature to see, and the footage comes straight out of the camera slowed down for you. Here are the camera's stabilization options. The top left footage is taken without stabilization, bottom left with optical stabilization from the lens, top right with the camera's digital stabilization as well, and bottom right enhanced digital stabilization. The digital stabilization crops into your footage a fair bit and helps, but doesn't perform any miracles, I'm afraid. This footage was taken by adapting Canon's old EFS 10-18mm lens onto the camera. The 18-45mm kit lens is nowhere near wide enough for this kind of vlogging footage, I'm afraid. overall, when it comes to still image and video quality, while it obviously doesn't compete with more expensive cameras, you're still getting fabulous quality pictures and video, especially when shooting at lower ISO levels. Really pleasing results here. So, this has been a real positive review so far. What don't I like about the R50? Honestly, there's very little to complain about here for a tiny sized, low budget offering. I don't like the horrible clapping noise of its shutter actuations, and certainly for my hands, those control buttons are a little small and fiddly. Then again, that's unsurprising on such a small camera. There are the usual niggles that come part and parcel with a more affordable camera. Its SD card slot is only the slower UHS 1 type. The battery power has only 3 stages of indication, meaning it can suddenly, or seemingly suddenly, run out on you. Be sure to keep a spare battery if you're going on a longer trip, and certainly if you're doing video work. And the lack of a headphone socket could be a little annoying to some more serious video makers, but they'll probably be drawn in the direction of a more expensive camera in the first place. A self-cleaning sensor might have been a bonus too. Perhaps though, Canon were aiming this camera at people who won't change lenses too often and get their sensor dusty. Apart from those niggles though, this is a bit of a killer low budget camera. My key issue with it is its lens selection, to be honest. The 18-45mm kit lens it comes with is mediocre. Canon's own selection of APS-C RF mount lenses is still under development, and unlike every other APS-C camera manufacturer, Canon continue to stubbornly refuse to allow third-party lenses onto their RF system, despite a major backlash from photographers about it. That means you may not ever see more affordable and enjoyable Tamron and Sigma lenses arriving on the system, which is a huge shame, because if their prime and zoom lenses were available on RF mounts right now, then the whole system would be much more recommendable and ready to jump into. It's a pain to have to use an adapter to get older digital SLR lenses to work on your camera. It's an extra expense and makes an otherwise tiny camera body bigger than a digital SLR, so that is annoying. But the camera itself is excellent. In my view, great value, huge fun, easily Canon's best low budget effort for years, and I loved testing it out. Let's hope its lens ecosystem gets a boost one way or the other as soon as possible.